This is the talk called Mother Nature's She Shed. Are you all here for that talk? Okay. We're going to have a smaller group, so if we could cluster more together, that would be helpful to me as a speaker because I want to kind of engage with you all and interact, if that's all right. My name is Liz Taggart, and I'm a board member for the BFA. I've worked with Dan for about 10 years. He's helped me bring my farm into a fully nutrient-dense farm. It's called Amba Farms, and it's in Bedford, New York. Amba is a Sanskrit word, A-M-B-A, the name of my farm, and the translation for it is Universal Mother. And I always knew if I had a farm, I'd want to name her Amba. The reason for that is I became interested in the ancient Vedic practices. Veda is a word, and I have some slides to show you about it. It means total knowledge. The Vedas are a huge body of knowledge that come from many thousands of years ago through an oral tradition. And they are basically cognitions from inner seeing by these ancient seers or rishis. What I will attempt to do today is show some compelling parallels between some of what we're finding in science and what the Vedas have provided us in information from those many thousands of years ago. So that's what we'll be doing today. And there's one fundamental principle that I want to introduce and make sure all of us understand it. And I want to say, from my side, I feel like my field of expertise, emerging expertise, let me say that, is from studying the Vedas, studying Sanskrit. I've been a meditation teacher for 45 years. I think I calculated, I think I've spent over 50,000 hours in meditation practices and continue to do so every day. So I can tell you what I've learned from that inside perspective, and I can tell you about the Vedas, but I'll touch on some science. But my strong guess is that those of you in the audience know more about the science than I do. So if you would help me by contributing into a discussion, so maybe we all learn more by the end of this hour and a half than when we came in. How's that sound? So I want to feel free to have it kind of open here, okay? Let's start with this one important principle. It's the vital principle, okay? Even though we have 19 layers, this is the one we need to know. How many of you in the talks that you've gone to have heard some language of we're all essentially coming to an integrated wholeness, that there's a quantum field of energy and intelligence from which everything emerges and submerges? How many of you are familiar with that concept? Okay. So there's this, and I'm making it like an unbounded ocean, okay? That's the biggest body we have on Earth. It's an unbounded ocean of energy. So we have all these fluctuations and frequencies, and it's pure potential, pure potentiality. So we have a field of intelligence full of energy and potential. And in living systems, this intelligence is awake to itself. It has a self-referral nature, so that when the intelligence is awake to itself, it can interact with its own intelligence and the environment. When intelligence is awake to itself, we call it intelligent intelligence. And what it simply means is that intelligence has the ability to know itself. Do we understand that? It's like a core principle. So in terms of the Vedas, pure unmanifest intelligence, pure existence, is considered the male principle. When intelligence is awake to itself, that experience of knowing itself, that it's able to interact, That's the female principle. So we have the male principle of pure existence, unmanifest, compact potency, and that's considered the male principle of the universe. And the female principle is that it knows itself. It's a dynamic. Okay? The male principle, it's silent, infinite possibilities, infinite potential, but it's just in its unmanifest state, existent state. And then as it knows itself, that dynamism, that female principle, and this is important, gives intelligence life. So the female principle gives intelligence life. And in Sanskrit, it's called samhita. And we'll learn a little bit more. I don't want to overwhelm you with terms, but it's considered self-referential. It keeps curving back on itself, taking feedback from the environment, creating back into the environment. So that female principle, in ancient times, it was considered to be what some Christians feel is the Holy Grail. It's that life principle that keeps generating life. What we'll hear towards the end of the presentation is there are different frequencies of these Vedic recitations that help create the impulse of pure silence, this pure male principle, and there are some frequencies that you hear that help create the dynamism of the female principle. These frequencies are used in India and Nepal, used to be used in Tibet and other countries for large groups of male pundits to come together and recite. It's a little over 2 hours. I've been to this many times. What's called a Rudra Abhishek, and the reverberations, especially they'll do it with 1,000 some pundits. The reverberations are so powerful, and that done on a regular basis broadcasts tremendous coherence to large environments. Female recitations, and that will be the last one we hear, that life principle, that brings all well-being and health and rich soil and rains on time and prosperity and play. The female principle is also called Leela, and it's the play of the unmanifest manifesting. Are you following me? Is this too complicated? Or okay, we're together so far. Okay. So for those of you who've just come in, I just go over, this is one essential point that throughout our course so far, our conference, we've learned so much about the interconnectedness, and that most of us are collected in our understanding that we're functioning from a unified field of unmanifest intelligent potential. And that's the same inner cognitions that the seers from many thousands of years ago perceived in the clarity of their awareness and was recorded 5,000 or 10,000 years ago, and that's my field of study, the Vedas. The principles that are recorded in the Vedas are very similar to some of the mathematical laws of nature that we study of gravity, electromagnetism, and other principles, laws of thermodynamics, but they also go into many other details. But how they're structured is based on how this principle of intelligence awakening to itself, that's starting to manifest out in fluctuations, it quantifies itself in 19 different levels. Okay? And it quantifies itself, and you're familiar with almost all of these levels. There's a way that we'll call this our field of intelligence here, intelligent energy. Here, it quantifies in an inward direction, and it's an eightfold. And on the external, it quantifies in an eightfold direction. And these mirror each other. So just right there, these are actually all the 19 principles. Because the first 3 principles are intelligence, knowing itself. And that's called the Samhita. That's first, second, and third principle of nature, of her, how she's structured. And then we'll start from the more manifest. It's in the elements: earth, water, fire, or light, air, and space. And space gives us direction and volume. So many laws of nature function from this element of space. So it goes from the less manifest and sequentially emerges into these 5 elements. Are you with me here? Okay, and then on the inside, we go from the less manifest. We have the ego experience. We have the intellect. These are our inner faculties. We have our mind. And then we have our senses, and our senses are our antennae of experience, right? So our senses go from subtler to gross. So space in the Vedas is associated, and you can help me with this, it's associated with hearing. What do you think air might be associated with? Sound. Well, this is associated with hearing. Air is associated with touch and feeling, like on our skin, how we feel. So this is touch, feeling. Fire or light, what sense would you associate with that? Sight, yes. And then water is taste. And then the last one is smell. So these are some of our building blocks that we'll be working with, and I'll show you again just to repeat in an illustration. But I wanted to get started while they worked out some of the kinks here. How many of you are familiar with some of the qualities of supercoherence that we find in earth or water or light or sound? Have any of you, are you familiar with laser light, for example? Oh, okay, well, the connection I'm trying to make is that all of nature is frequency based. So these are fluctuations of frequency. As it manifests into light, for example, then what we can find is as the frequencies become coherent, the effects, the qualities become more powerful. Whereas light in general can be very scattered, in laser light, when it's coherent and the frequencies are lined up, they're operating in synchrony, then we're able to have laser light. Does that make sense to folks? And laser light allows for a number of applied technologies that they can even do surgeries with laser light. There are so many different ways that it helps us understand the cosmos more. There are just all sorts of applications. So what I'm putting forward here is that there's many examples of how when coherence starts to operate in these different layers that nature's designed, the power of the coherence gives us much more, many more tools to use to learn more or to apply medically or to move forward in some progress. And what I'm going to also show is the other side, that as coherence develops within our own consciousness, even coming to the course here, the conference, we develop a certain coherence and a deeper understanding that creates more of an inner platform. There are examples in the Vedas of how that inner coherence manifests into supercoherence and allows us to have more sensitive, developed faculties of our attention and intention and several other faculties. I'll also show how we use it with plants. But I want to make a little prediction here. How many are familiar with the term holon? Is Holon? You are. Do you want to tell us what it is?
No.
Okay. Holon, they're found in a living system. And what it simply is, I think the term was coined in 2016. But holon refers to a cell. They're usually in living systems. Let's just stick with cell for now. And what it does is it does its own job, but it remembers that it's within a context of another part of a living system. Like say you have heart cells. The one cell knows its job, but it's working in concert with the other parts of the heart, which is working in concert with how the circulatory system functions. So there's this awareness of being connected to a whole. That's actually an ideal definition for the word coherence. Coherence comes from the verb cohere, and then you make it into a noun. But cohere is to come together, functioning similarly, like you have coherence in different frequencies, but the coherence is aware of it being in the context of a whole. So when we look at some of these elemental systems or our own inner system, that coherence becomes key in allowing for these more powerful faculties to exhibit or develop. So when we think about it, we're almost always acting within the context of a whole, right? We're in a family system, we're in a work system, we're in a conference system. And we know what it's like to function incoherently, we know what it's like to function coherently. And we've covered most of these points. We live in an intelligible universe. When intelligence is intelligent, it's intelligible. So then intelligence is both the male and female principle. Do you kind of have that core point? And it's intelligence knowing and interacting with itself. Okay. We've talked about the quantum field. We've also talked about the ancient Vedic science, which was perceived by seers in their own inner clarity. Many of our modern day scientists would be called seers as well, as they perceive the frequencies and fluctuations that provide insight and solutions to different problems or provide theories that are then later proven. In the Vedas, there's one book in the Vedas, and I'll show you a diagram in a minute, but the Vedas are this huge body of 40 branches of ancient knowledge. They go anywhere from the science of consciousness to the study of architecture and jewelry and astrology and human physiology. For these intents and purposes, we're going to refer to the 19 enclosures of Gayatri. And you were starting to hear the Gayatri mantra. Gayatri is the female Mother Nature in the Vedas. How many of you have heard the Greek term Gaia? Yes, it's Greek for Mother Earth, for all of manifestation. Gaia is. So Gaia and Gaia, tree is gives it a feminine quality. We have Gaia, and we also, another thing that I learned in preparing this presentation is the Latin word for matter came from its original word, mater, which means mother. So in these different cultures, and I think we could go on for a long time about looking at different cultures and seeing how instinctively, wherever we were, we knew that there was this female principle, life principle, that was instrumental in our creation and in continuing to manifest it. So what we'll learn more of today is how it manifests through the elements and through our consciousness. So Gaia Tree is the essential creative life force. And in her design, she designed 19 enclosures to herself, almost like cocoons, layers of cocoons. And when you map them out, they end up being a large, kind of like a cyclone. It could be a cyclone, but in Sanskrit it's called a rick, but it's a spiral, a large, large spiral. So what we want to look at is, we already kind of looked at this really, but what's intelligence, what's coherence, what's consciousness. Consciousness is fundamentally that unbounded field within each of us that is pure energy and intelligence. It's why we're called human beings and not human doings, is because with our inner silent consciousness, we do have the ability to be and then become. And the Vedas are all focused on where being becomes, that area. We talked about some of these examples of coherence. Let me talk about a couple of others, and this is where I'd love your input. We have examples of supercoherence where we have these holons lining up, these coherent frequencies that when they act coherent, I know, for example, with laser light, it's a tiny fraction of 1% of the frequencies have to become coherent, have to become in sync. They have to function as the holons of the system. With that tiny percentage, 100% of it becomes a laser light. It's the same thing with in superfluidity. Who's familiar with superfluidity? Superfluidity is a feature that as you lower, using the third law of thermodynamics, if you lower the temperature of certain minerals or metals, the closer you get to absolute zero, the more fluid. It becomes so fluid that there's zero viscosity. There's no resistance in the fluidity of that metal, which has allowed for all sorts of scientific applications in industry, the superfluidity. Who's familiar with superconductivity? Superconductivity, again, when you lower the entropy, that's what thermodynamics, the third law of thermodynamics, as we lower the entropy through bringing it closer to absolute zero, you run into this same phenomenon that in certain metals that there's no resistance to the electromagnetic charge running through it. And again, it's not even 1% of the molecules that become coherent in their frequencies, and the rest become supercoherent. So in ultrasounds, sonograms, different applications of vibrations. We have this, again, that when we have this very small percentage of frequencies, then we're able to apply the coherent models which create very powerful influences into the environment. This is the primary reason on my farm why I played all sorts of Vedic recitations, because those are considered super frequencies. And I would play those to the plants as the plants grew. And I'll show you some examples of that a little bit later. But sometimes it's so much easier if we can first think from matter, from the matter manifest universe, and then work back to apply it to what our potential is within our own minds and faculties. Any questions so far? Comments? Good. Nap time? Feels like nap time, a little Sunday afternoon. Yeah, you're going to be hearing a variety of different ones. I hope you like them. So this is just an example of some of the, well, of the whole alphabet, of the Sanskrit alphabet. And I just quickly wanted to touch on it because it is a character language. Each character has a whole story in how that character came to be. And it's what you would call an anatomical language, because it's based on how the human body pushes sound through its vocal cords and its throat and its mouth and its lips. So every consonant and vowel comes from how the body naturally functions, like ah, e. You have t, t for dental. You have where you touch the roof of your mouth. And there are more and more studies that are being done that show that the study and speaking Sanskrit, this Sanskrit's widely recognized as the original mother language to planet Earth. It enlivens all sorts of different parts of your brain as you speak different parts of the Veda. It shares a very intimate relationship with the human body itself. I mentioned to you how we have these huge, we have 4 main branches, and then we have 36 auxiliary branches of the Veda. Each one is very dense in the amount of knowledge that's available. So these 19 enclosures, you would have to take one leaf from here and take the tip of the leaf and divide it into 12, and then take 1/12 of it, and that's what we're studying today in terms of the 19 enclosures of Mother Divine. That's how vast. I mean, I've been studying it since I was 15, and so it'll be, you know, a number of decades. And I'm barely a novice. That's how vast and profound this body of knowledge is. But even the reason it's called total knowledge is because they have to satisfy this requirement that in every point, the whole story can be understood. So in this very tip of one leaf, from chapter 12, the whole story is understood about Gayatri and her 19 enclosures of her abode. The 19 enclosures include all the elements from which she manifests. That's why I refer to it as a she shed, because it's her creative tools, her palette that she uses, and then inner faculties of our senses and abilities to experience. I have some different examples. Many of you have gone to yoga or have a practice of yoga or are familiar with it. How many people? That's all from one tiny slice of one leaf, again, in this field of Vedic literature. Vastu, the study of architecture, again, just a small part. Ayurveda, how many are familiar with Ayurveda? That's one whole leaf. So Ayurveda gets one whole leaf in this tree. And then Gandharva Veda is some of the musical frequencies and fluctuations, which I also played. And when I play the Gayatri mantra, that's the original mantra for the Vedas. It's her describing 3 spheres that she's creating. And I'll play that. And then the Bhagavad Gita is another one people know. This is Gayatri describing herself. So what she's describing here is how she, surrounding all of Gayatri's 19 enclosures, is this milky ocean, a cosmic brine from which she conjures and creates. It's kind of a mixture. 10,000 years ago, they didn't know that they had to separate subjective and objective. So they could express the most scientific knowledge in a poetic expression, and they were allowed to do that. So we need to kind of marry those parts back together, because really, as we're learning on this conference, the world is as we are, and we are as our world is. So we're really the flow of the same reality. Gayatri, this is an artist rendition of her, but if I had more time, every single appointment in this design has a special significance for each of the elements and for some of the forces associated with those elements. But that would be a longer discussion. So out of this milky ocean comes these different materials, which we now have learned are the elements. But if we go back to that original male and female principle, we have that huge field of just intelligence and potential that is not stirred. It's just silent and awake to itself. As soon as that intelligence starts to know itself, becomes wakeful, and starts to stir, that's the female principle. So the first way that it's stirred, those first stirrings, are called the tanmatras. And out of those tanmatras, there are 5 of them. On the inner, it manifests as hearing in our senses. On the outer, space as one of the elements. So this is sort of reviewing what we covered earlier. Any questions on this? This is an illustration of what I drew on the whiteboard when we were working out our technical problems. But that center core, we're calling it knower, knowing, and known. It's that silent intelligence starting to stir in itself. And it actually, in Sanskrit, how it translated, it stirs, how it first stirs is with a direction. And then space comes from that direction. And in an inner experience, direction is defined as intention. So you know how we're starting to learn more and more about our own powers of attention and intention, how that can work for us. How many have some familiarity with that? Okay, so this is where attention and intention reside, is in that silent field starting to stir, both male and female principle operating. This is a more concrete example of the knower wanting to learn about a microphone, the known, and the process of learning about it. But in this abstraction that we've reviewed today, it's more the field of intelligence being awake to itself. So this is the knower inside of us reflecting inward, say in a meditation practice, and coming to that same quantum field that we've located in so many of our sciences, that same field of infinite possibility, infinite potential, unbounded, no boundaries, pure energy filled with fluctuation, but not manifest yet. How many are with me on this? Okay. And then I wanted to show how frequently nature manifests in a spiral, because this is always her signature, is manifesting in this eightfold spiral as the senses emerge out of an individual, or as the elements emerge and matter is created. So it's always this spiral, and if you start to look around, it's hard to choose which would be your favorite spirals, because they're almost everywhere found in creation. They're kind of her signature, I would say. This is an example of inner coherence. Let me go back to her slide and shut that off. Thank you. I mentioned that I've taught meditation for many years, decades. This is just a brief snippet of Dr. Fred Travis measuring someone as she sits to meditate and showing how these patterns of coherence and frequency emerge within the first seconds of meditation. Okay. So basically, Fred Travis is really a leading research in brain research and meditation. And this is showing transcendental meditation, and just within a few seconds, really, of her closing her eyes and starting to meditate. It's a great 5-minute segment on YouTube if you care to see the whole thing. As she closes her eyes and starts to meditate, all these frequencies of coherence come in to her consciousness. And this happens with so many meditation practices, but I know for myself that experience happens every time I meditate, or any time I teach someone to meditate. So the reason I want to talk about that potential for increasing coherence, when they did studies on long-time meditators, what they found is that strong alpha coherence is maintained in activity. So even you can be in very dynamic activity, but there's a part of your brain that's deeply centered into a silent coherence. And so then I wanted to lay out these two faculties that we have within our mind and our intellect, which are let me go back to this chart. We have, in our eightfold, we have the ego, intellect, and mind. Intention comes from the intellect, that faculty within our awareness, and attention is mind. And attention in Sanskrit is dhyan. That's the Sanskrit word for attention. And it's the flow of awareness in our mind. And it's our power center for fulfilling any desire, especially the closer we're connected to the silent source within us, the more easily any desire we have is a desire that nature has. And the circumstances conspire to fulfill those desires. So the potential is enormous, and that silent inner awareness can be tracked to some clumsy degree through brainwave frequency in studying that. I think as years pass, we're going to see more and more ways. They now look at blood chemistry and breath and all sorts of biophysical functioning. Intention is a function of our intellect. Intellect gives us direction and purpose. So Sanskrit, the word is sankalp. So you have dhyan for mind and sankalp for intellect. And it's whatever the desired outcome is that you want. But I will have to say that this environment, it's a life-affirming environment. So chances are, if you wish a person well, that desire will be fulfilled more easily than if you wish they were dead, because your desires need to align more with nature in order for that attention and intention to have life-supporting manifestation. Does that make sense to you all? So this is a little bit more of an elaboration. Sankalp, we're directing an action for a specific outcome. So, for example, in preparation to plant seeds, you have an intention. Like in Vedic organic agriculture, our whole personality is mirrored in the whole personality of our farm. They're the outer layers and we're the inner layers. So we have our seeds. So you do an offering of gratitude to the sun and water and your elements that are going to bring it to life. And then you can do a little ceremony to those elements. Oftentimes it's to the sun. You can have the intention of what you want those seeds to do. You breathe on them, you inhale and then softly exhale. You're giving your life breath to your seeds. You even prepare a little mix of an inoculant that includes your spit, because again, that's part of who you are. The farmer and the farm share almost the same name in Sanskrit. There's no perceived separation, except I think the farmer works a little harder than the farm, but it's most effective. The attention and intention is most effective when you're operating closer and closer to your inner nature. That's what we call it, our inner nature, right? Our being, becoming. That's where you have your attention and your intentions when you're serious about manifesting them. Any comments or questions? Attention. Attention's interesting. It serves a double duty. And that is that it's sometimes referred to even as lamp at the door, that we have our attention, the ability to flow outward and observe, but also inward to know ourselves and to determine things for ourselves. So what we put our attention on, one of the first laws of nature of the Vedas is what we put our attention on grows stronger in our life. So as we put our attention on more life-supporting influences, life supports us more. As we put our attention or have our intentions more on damaging influences, then damaging influences dominate more in our life. That's the law of karma. which has its whole story. How we focus the power of our attention influences the objects. How many are familiar with that Heisenberg uncertainty principle, that as soon as we observe, we change the observation? So we can use that in very powerful ways, especially when we're working in growing things or sorting things out. Using our attention can just, especially if it's coherent and is more powerful, we can help dispel incoherence. Just it's our natural vibration that our inner coherence dispels weaker incoherence. Now there's a whole, it's the third chapter of the Yoga Sutras. There are only 244 Yoga Sutras. There are 4 chapters. And the third chapter describes some of the different human faculties that are latent or nascent in us that can be developed and used as part of our human potential. You know, we feel we don't use much of our human potential. These are some of our latent faculties. One of them, when you are operating from that quiet level in your mind, you're paying attention and you have it's a softest thinking intention. For intentions, it's almost better, they can be specific, but if it's thought at a softest, almost feeling level. Does that make sense? Intention dwells at the level where the intellect and feeling meet. So when you have a quiet feeling for your intention, that's oftentimes the most powerful for it. In the Yoga Sutras, one of the examples, there are like 40 different faculties outlined. One of them is called Ritambhara Pragya, and it's at that faculty where you're maintaining a silent awareness, and then your attention is flowing, and your intellect, your intention, you have an intention to know something. Then whatever you want to know can appear even in a holographic form, or you can examine all the details of it, or you can just ask a question. Ritambhara Pragya, it's the sprouting of consciousness where truth resides. So you know how we say, well, trust your gut. You know, I have a feeling about this. Those are like glimmers of this faculty we have to know just by our being. And as consciousness becomes more established and coherent, that faculty becomes handy. You can discern into the truth of things with great confidence. So that's one of the ones. Another one is pasha. That's a Sanskrit word for seeing. And it's just this, and I worry that it's on the extinction list because I think humans spend so much time with their awareness outward into these localized bits of information. So our awareness is trained to just be local, local, local on points, and we're overstimulated in data. Whereas pasha is this entire faculty where you operate from the field of being and you see on the inside, you see the whole majesty of your inner landscape and all of its knowledge and truth. And this is where that pasha occurred for Vyasa, the seer, who cognized Gayatri and her 19 enclosures and then recorded it. And that's the knowledge I'm sharing with you now. But our ability to see within is so far more than our time spent on the internet. But I worry that if we only spend our time having our senses stimulated in an artificial way, humans are going to lose this ability to live more the full potential of a life that's beyond description for an inner reality. So I don't say that to disturb someone, but maybe just to bring some attention and intention to being more balanced. Now, I'll go a little bit into when you grow with Vedic agriculture, you have these specific intentions for how you want your plants to grow. Plants in their full potential have the ability to emit and inhabit completely coherent frequencies, both within its own different sets of living systems and the overall living system, and also into the environment. And we know so much of the practicum of that in how insects will detect light coming from incoherent frequencies but not coherent frequencies. Plants also have the ability to have a coherent pulse. I'll talk a little bit more about that. They have this ability to have this vitality that not only nourishes us with our nutrients and biosphere and prana and life force, but also it helps produce a digestive substance that helps create higher states of consciousness, higher fields of awareness. They can function like that. It's like very deep healing. They have the ability to grow within a crystalline structure. We know the influence of sounds, intentions on water, for example. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that, where the scientist, Emoto, thank you, gave one group negative intentions and one group positive intentions. And one group had beautiful crystalline structures and the other ones were shadowy, almost frightening structures. So plants with positive reinforcement and their needs met, because they're so water-based, have that ability to have very coherent crystalline structures within the water base of that plant. And then there's a holistic substance that can develop that greatly, it's called soma, and it greatly enhances and it enhances life force and inhibits aging. And one study I want to mention with long-term meditators, it goes all the way down to the DNA level, where how many are familiar with telomeres? They're at the tail end of the genetic structure. And they tend, and please help me out here if I make any mistakes, okay? But they tend to replicate less and less perfectly as we age, right? So what was found with long-term meditators is the telomeres stay intact much longer over time. They replicate more perfectly. And it just shows how that coherence seeps in even to beyond tissue level. So the coherent frequencies, we know all these different studies that were done on plants about playing music. One study in the late 1800s and in the 1970s, they played actually Gandharva Veda music from the Vedas. And in one study, the plants grew at almost a 60-degree angle to where the music was coming from. And so I wanted to share that. They very strongly respond to those coherent frequencies. And then Chandra Bose in the early 20th century, he conducted several studies that observed the cortex tissue of growing plants. And this is now in high school science. The young man that helped me put together the PowerPoint presentation said, Mrs. Taggart, I think I could improve your wording here. And so they're learning this now in biology, that just like we have our circulatory system, the plants pump sap, and ideally they should be pumping the sap in tune with the light pulses of the change of the day, and they have that's their natural circadian rhythm. And so plants growing that are well taken care of are able to live in just that natural rhythm of the elemental environment. Maximum vitality in plants, where everything you eat brings this concentrated life force of vitality. It's for the Gayatri, it's called Shakti, Shakti. How many have heard of that? It's just pure, intense, dynamic life force. And that's what each human has in their physiology, but we often have blocks to it. So when we're eating the right food and drinking the right water, protecting ourselves and our environment, or creating a coherent environment, this life force becomes unblocked. And so say we're like different watts of bulbs. You may be a 100-watt bulb on the inside, but maybe you're only broadcasting at 10 watts because your life force is congested. The plant family has the ability to break open those blocks if it's grown properly. It absorbs coherence, feeds you coherence, and you become a broadcaster. These I'll just do quickly. In the Vedas, there are 8 stages of plant growth, and each one is related to one of the 8. They're called prakritis. They're an extension of Gayatri. Gayatri manifests as Prakriti, and Prakriti is simply nature manifesting. And she manifests in a sequence. So in the upper corner we have seeds. We're starting a new crop. That's the level, that's actually the last level. We plant our seeds in the earth after we've prepared our earth. And that we're starting at the earth element, which is associated with smell, and it's associated with a life force called apana. Apana life force associated with the earth is downward life force. So you have the earth starting to grow roots. That's what you want to do with your seeds. Between each of these stages, there are these special recitations that you can play to support that part of the life cycle. They're from each of the mandalas that are in the giant Rig Veda that we saw in the tree that we saw. So then the water is the next element. You have your first rains, or you water your earth so the seed has a chance to start to grow in a moist environment. Then you have sprouting, where you start to have your biochemistry, and that's associated with fire, but also sunlight. And there are other life forces. I won't go into them right now. You have your identifying plant leaves. That's your fourth. That's associated with air. And also you have your fifth. It's the growth and expansion of the plant, so you start to get the volume of the plant. So that's the space and hearing. That's when you start to get the architecture and dimension of your plant. Then as the plant matures, it starts to go into its reproductive cycle, and you have it flowering. That's where you have the flow of that life source maturing through its channels and then becoming enough of an identity that it has its own mind. It starts to know how to function. That colorless sap in that part of the plant is awake to itself. It's a holon, though. It's part of a living system that's connected to all of its parts. And that's considered the mind aspect, where you have your field of attention. And then the fruiting is considered your purpose, your direction, where you're going into reproducing your identity. And that's where you come to a new seed or crop, which is the ego, which is the whole sense of self for that plant. So I thought a growing example might be helpful in understanding this eightfold cycle. I touched on this earlier. The name that some researchers in Europe are giving to this special substance that can mature and grow in plants is vital quality. And having grown for 10 years on a farm where we applied these practices, it's as if there was a luster to the vegetables or to the leaves. It's there's like a quality that you can almost see, but it was just that plant was vital. It was a healthy, radiant example of a zucchini or a tomato or an arugula. And I would have very famous people comment, because I live in an area of a lot of celebrities and New York City with all its restaurants, and people would say, I don't know what it is, but when I eat your food, it makes me feel amazing. There's a peace that comes from it, there's an energy, there's a harmony. And I don't share what my growing practices are unless someone asks, but they just want how they feel. One example of that was Ralph Lauren. His chef came to my farm for years, and then when he opened his Polo Lounge on Fifth Avenue, he asked his chef if I would provide to that restaurant, because his whole family noticed how that Sunday meal, they just always felt different from when they ate on the road a lot. So I want to ask you to kind of open your mind a little bit more. And let's almost take a journey to a little bit of a different perspective, because this ancient principle of this field of silent, compact potential has its roots in tens of thousands of years, if not longer. And what you saw on the screen is the mountain called Mount Kailash. Have any of you heard of Mount Kailash before? Okay, so it's a mountain in Tibet. And for over 15,000 years, people from all different religions have undertaken this 32-mile circumambulating hike through elevations between 12,000 feet and 16,000 feet to pay honor to this silent, cosmic potential that they feel manifested into Mount Kailash. And personally, I've been to a lot of different opportunities where I could listen to these ancient recitations of the Rudra Abhishekam, which is the little over 2-hour ceremony, which completely enlivens this field of silent peace. And my teacher, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, I studied with him for decades. He felt that this recitation of the Rudra Abhishekam was the most powerful way to create coherence, peace, and vitality in our world family. So over the past couple of decades, he's had schools in India and Nepal and a couple of other places where male pundits, you have to be male to chant the Rudra Abhishekam, male pundits chanting these recitations, it's the male principle, and to be in that environment, and I'm just playing a little snippet of one where 1,000 pundits were reciting. It's like you're in the center of this beehive, where you know how when you're around bees and there's that humming and it's just this like throbbing frequency, but it's this mass of voices together in this intense coherence. And I find it gives me hope, because every year they graduate another group of 1,000 pundits or 500 or 600 pundits, and the goal is to have, just like we have with the coherence and superconductivity and laser light and other areas of supercoherence in nature, to have the square root of 1% of the world's population hearing being covered in these vibrations of Rudra Abhishekam. And there are also many other recitations, but the Rudra Abhishekam is the most potent for peace and coherence, for that injection. So this, I had to just do a short one because it wouldn't broadcast otherwise. So. So it's right on YouTube if you look for Rudra Abhishekam. It's a whole side of humanity that practices all these ancient traditions that we may not even be aware of on this side. But I want to make a prediction that I feel confident in, and that is a lot of us have focused a lot on what to do about our climate crisis and what does our carbon footprint look like. And I think in the next 10, 20, 30 years, what we're going to shift to is we're going to shift to what is our coherence broadcast? What coherence are we broadcasting into our environment? So instead of what are we over-consuming and leaving a footprint, it's more us realizing we're holons. We're functional, important, purposeful parts of a bigger whole. And we're broadcasting with the most potential we can, coherence and consciousness into our environment. There's one little secret I wanted to share with you, and that is in this field of the masculine, where it's just like we heard the recitations, and as it starts to know itself and we start to have that dynamism of it knowing itself, that dynamism is the female. Now, as the feminine starts to stir and create, what is first created is love. We live in a benefic universe that is soaked in love and kindness. And that's part of our original nature. So as we broadcast coherence, it automatically includes coherent love. And it's not like a romantic, dramatic, up and down. It's just this steady force, and it's Shakti itself. So in that vision of what I think our next paradigm will be, I have great hope for us when I look at the true, authentic reverberations of our intelligence knowing itself and our universe manifesting. The last recitation, and it's just a minute long, and then we can have a few questions, is the female principle of nature. Shri is one of her names. Is the bringer of all abundance and goodness. And I'm playing a minute of this one particular recitation that depicts her with gold coins pouring off of her from everywhere. And she is soil. She is all good fortune. She's all blessings. She's all wealth. She's all health. She's all abundance. And so this is a 15-minute recitation that I'm just playing a minute, but it's just her expression of showering her love and abundance on anyone who wants to hear it. So those are the reverberations that you're absorbing. What? That's one of her spirals. Okay, so I know I covered a lot of complicated material. I hope you were able to follow it and make some sense out of it. And it's been a pleasure sharing this with you all. Any questions or comments? Intuition, instinct, my gut tells me, but I never listen. But that's what we're talking about, really getting to the center of your nature, which is your instinct. For humans, we have more than just a primal instinct. We have the ability to come to a place of profound truth instinct in so many areas of life. Well, what I shared about the seeds, and then, if you go to YouTube anymore, you can get really wonderful Vedic recitations that or Gandharva Ved, which plays for different periods of time during the day, but also taking care of yourself. In Sanskrit, it's Krishak and Krishi, Kri being the operative term for Kri is life-supporting activity. So that's Kri is for farm and farmer. So when we take care of ourselves and we can culture this inner connection that allows us to better connect to the subtleties of our farm, then it allows for that communion that we all naturally develop with our farm, but perhaps in a way, in Sanskrit it's said eham dukam anagatam, which means avert the danger that has not yet come. The more on a subtle level you can communicate or feel or operate with instinct, the more you can avert things before they manifest into a full-fledged problem, whether it's drought or insects or disease or something like that. Taking care of ourselves allows us that ability to culture our awareness and skills of observation. Well, the Vedic explanation is this, that female essence is the cause of life. So nature goes through extremes to protect that spark of life. So if humans were in tune with nature, it wouldn't be there wouldn't be a Me Too movement because we wouldn't need one. It would be that both roles are honored as essential, And also that the female nervous system, because it carries that spark of life and the womb for creating it, is totally protected and honored and respected. And in turn, there's an interacting dynamic that then that nourishment takes care of her environment. But we're all backwards on that right now. And it's one reason I wanted to focus on a female version of how nature functions, because that vibration needs to be understood and metabolized into our collective consciousness. The life force women carry is beyond essential in its importance. So that's only one example of so many. Look at how the bud tightly wraps around the flower, and how a cocoon's made and how a womb works. And on the other hand, the male principle in the Vedas is a lingam, which is basically an erect penis. And that just shows the pure potential life force. So you see how these forces of nature manifest into what humans' anatomy looks like, but it comes from a much deeper source of creation. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. That's what I hope to add to my environment. I hope to become a broadcaster. But invite all of you to become that, because it only makes sense. We have this ability to create coherence within us. That's our power. And it's a matter of metabolizing that into really a life that's worth living. Thank you all so much for coming.